Hi everyone, it's Marina here from the Jungal freelancing community, where we make professional services simpler for everyone. And I'm joined here today by Kirilea Kelly, who's the Marketing and Corporate Liaison Manager from the Red Tree Foundation. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here. Now, the Red Tree Foundation are one of our globalist clients, and today is a chance for us to showcase a more unique part of our business to business professional service offering, and for you and for our community to become aware of some services out there that they just may not be aware of. So I'm looking forward to this chat. It should be really interesting. Now, just before we begin and we get into this little exchange, a quick trigger warning. Because a Red Tree Foundation cover off grief and bereavement counselling for individuals and B2B, we're going to be delving into a couple of really tricky topics around death, and Kirilea will probably share a lived experience as well. So if those topics are in any way make you uncomfortable, this video is not for you. We'll put details of their service down in the links below, but maybe skip over it if need be. But let's get into it because it is a topic that I think we're all relatively uncomfortable talking about. So let's just talk a bit about, what is grief? Like, what is it all about?
Yeah, it's a great first question. So one of the best quotes I've seen related to grief is that grief is the price that we pay for love. Grief is the natural response that all humans have to loss, particularly the death of a loved one, but not necessarily. It can also be related to a life-limiting diagnosis or a change in life circumstance. It's a pretty complex process involving a range of feelings. It can include sadness, anger, numbness, even guilt. It's a deeply personal experience, and everybody experiences grief differently. But essentially what it is it's the all-encompassing response to a negative change in life circumstance. And we also know, as you said, it's something that everyone will experience at some point in their lifetime and probably multiple times throughout their life as well.
Yeah, I think when you and I were talking, raised some statistics that 1 in 4 Australians will experience an episode of grief over the last 12 months, which makes it a pretty big impact to the Australian workforce as well.
Absolutely, yes. So 1 in 4 Australians, or 1 in 4 employees, I guess is another way of putting it, will experience grief and loss in some capacity each year. Not everybody will need professional support, but many will, and everybody will need an empathetic workplace response to that situation. So yeah, it is a large proportion of people, workplaces that are experiencing this each year.
Now, in this world of, we have a better understanding of well-being and employee experience and how we can support them. When we're looking at grief counselling from a professional services perspective, why do you think it matters so much and to know about these skills and how we support people in the workplace?
Yeah, great question. And I might answer that by kind of giving a bit of my story and my background. So in 2020, I was pregnant with my first son. Fortunately, I lost Leo during my pregnancy, quite far along in my pregnancy. And the response that I had, I was actually employed by two different workplaces at the time. The response that I had from each workplace was quite different. One handled it particularly well, and one didn't handle it so well at all in regards to bereavement, maternity leave, those kinds of things. I will say, without mentioning the workplace, that the workplace that didn't handle it so well has actually gone about a process of revising a lot of their bereavement and maternity leave kind of information or the policies that they provide to their staff since my loss. So it's really nice to hear that some good has come out of that, and that anybody that might experience that in the future will be well supported. But in the moment, I had one, as I said, one workplace that handled it well, but one that didn't handle it so well. When I started my grief counselling with Red Tree Foundation, thankfully I was referred after the passing of Leo by the hospital to Red Tree Foundation. When I started my grief counselling with Red Tree Foundation, my counsellor told me that my story around my workplace, I guess, not supporting my situation as well as they probably could have or should have, was not an isolated story by any means, that many of her clients had said the same thing. And she also told me that a lot of the time that becomes a new grief situation, that the workplace not necessarily supporting or providing the support that's needed, and counselling can then start being focused on that situation as opposed to the core grief situation. So based on that, I kind of thought, well, maybe we can do it better. Maybe we can support workplaces, to do employee grief support better. And that's where I ended up working as the corporate liaison manager at Red Tree Foundation.
Which is wonderful. And I can see how that passion, and thank you for sharing that lived experience. And I'm also just so sorry you've gone through that, all elements of that story. It's a terrible thing to have gone through. And I'm very grateful that you've been able to use that passion and that energy to be able to, really put it into your work and be able to pass some of the importance on to employers. And it really creates that sense of humanity and professional services that we're also passionate about. So let's talk around these, what does good look like in 2025 and going forward? And how do we support our employees? So what is the best in class employee experiences you can offer when looking specifically at grief support?
Yeah, great question. So actually also my other job is an academic. So of course I went down the rabbit hole of doing a bit of research on what the answer to that question is. What does good look like? And research shows time and time again that a management team actually trained, not just comfortable, but provided professional development in best practice grief and loss support for employees is extremely impactful to an employee's processing of their grief, allowing that employee a timelier and more successful reintegration back into the workplace. Another statistic that's quite interesting is that 50% of employees will consider moving on from their workplace after a grief and loss situation. It essentially comes down to the fact that big life changes make you kind of question what you're doing, where you're at in life, and 50% will consider moving on from their employer. And all the more reason to ensure that we're providing our managers with the best possible support in how to support employees in the instance of grief and loss, especially going back to that previous statistic of 1 in 4 employees experiencing this every year.
Yeah, I can imagine that moment of truth. And it's interesting how you had the contrast of the two employers at the same time. But if it was handled well or with respect and dignity, that it could actually engender quite a lot of support and loyalty and mutual respect.
Definitely. Absolutely. I'm still employed by my employer that handled it well. And I find myself a bit of an ambassador for that employer, not a grief and loss employer in any means. As I mentioned, I'm an academic as well as working for Red Tree Foundation. And yes, absolutely, the response forms part of that healing process for sure.
Now, Red Tree provide corporate training or organisational training where you'll come in and be able to brief and train leaders. So they're not going to feel all uncomfortable. I mean, a lot of people don't like talking about death, and you actually help leaders go through that process and tell them what's appropriate as well, don't you?
We do, yes. So Red Tree Foundation provides corporate manager training, leaders and manager training in how to support employees in grief and loss situations. It's run by one of our qualified grief counsellors, so not me. An actual qualified grief counsellor runs the training. And the great thing about that is they are the most experienced, in grief and loss best practice, but they also, are supporting hundreds and hundreds of clients a year. And so they're receiving feedback from clients on what works, helps, and what hinders. So yes, our counsellors can come in and do a corporate training session for managers, leaders and managers to support them to support employees before it happens as well, which is quite important.
I think it's so important. I mean, we're a massive proponent of skills generating confidence for our community. And I think just even having some guidelines or some resources before it happens, it's going to allow you to feel more confident and be a better leader, I think, in those moments of truth where people look to you for support. Well, outside of productivity or getting stuff done, like just the human side of it, such a valuable service.
Absolutely. And what we often find is that the managers that do our training take what they've learned, and it's not just at work that they implement what they've learned as well. They've told us that it makes them, more empathetic family members and partners and friends, or they reflect back on a situation where they've now learned that they could have supported someone, more than they did or in a different way. So it helps with that life skill element as well.
Such an incredibly powerful. I'm just reflecting on having lost people in my own life. That awkward silence
Yes.
when you sort of re-enter life after that period of grief, and then no one really knows what to say. So often they will say nothing, and it's actually not necessarily what you need.
Absolutely. We often, when we do talk in the training, our counsellors talk about saying something, anything is better than saying nothing at all, even if what is said is not quite right and it's maybe a bit clunky. A lot of our clients talk about the fact that the silence is what stays, not the clunky words. So again, that's just one of the things that we often talk about in the training, that, even platitudes, is that the right word? Platitudes, I think. I'm not sure if that's a word, but even that'll do. Even those kind of, the generic statements, while they're not the best thing to say, it's certainly better than saying nothing at all. Or not acknowledging the loss or pretending it didn't happen and business as usual. So yes, those are the kinds of questions. It's a very interactive training as well. So those are the types of questions and scenarios that can be run over during a training session.
Now, I wasn't going to share this, but I'll just share very quickly. I had an experience many years ago where I lost someone, and I was in quite a high-powered type of job. And I remember walking in and getting quite triggered because the last time I'd been in that office, that person was alive. So all these memories, this sort of weird thing, the brain started to play. But I had to go into a meeting and I was actually trembling, which is quite unusual for me, but that's stress and grief. And I remember the extraordinary pressure of having to perform in the same manner I had to, like, prior to this event. And it still stays with me. And I remember just looking at the keyboard. It's like, it's a memory just, sort of emblazoned in my mind about no one knows how much I've changed. But on the outside, I was being asked to perform at that level. And it was very difficult.
Yeah. And one of the things as well, I know I recall from my experience I've heard many of our clients say too, is when you re-enter the workplace, everything else has stayed the same, but you are so different. And it's you're almost angry about it. A lot of people do feel quite frustrated that everyone else is just sort of going about like nothing has changed and you feel like a completely different person. I also remember one of the best things my manager did for me at the time when I entered the workplace was she put me in her office. I sat in her office as opposed to out on the floor, surrounded by kind of co-workers and out in open space. And for the first month or so, that was how I re-entered the workplace. So it was little things like that made such a difference in feeling like I was seen and heard, and my grief was being acknowledged, and that they were actually putting things in place to help support me, which was really, really lovely.
And what an amazing expression of leadership to be so protective over someone and to not put you in a spot where you're going to feel uncomfortable. Everyone watches that, and leaders, they just go, look, that's classy. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the words of Anchorman, stay classy. Yeah.
That's it. Stay classy. That's exactly right. It's about being classy. It's about being human. And also one other thing I'll say is we often talk about in the training as well, if you do feel like you're worried about saying the wrong thing, you don't need to say anything. You could do something that shows that you're thinking about that person when they return, maybe putting a coffee, takeaway coffee on their desk with a note or something like that, saying thinking of you. Those little sort of moments really stick with someone who's experienced grief. It just shows that people are there for them, even if they're not quite sure what to say.
Yeah, it's an acknowledgement that we're here, and I'm standing next to you in some way. Wow, what an incredible service you offer. And I think it's so valuable. You also provide one-on-one specialised support to complement existing, perhaps, employee assistance programs, but you're a part of that ecosystem that can help organisations offer something to employees. Do you want to briefly just explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So on top of the corporate training, we also, as you've said, Marina, we offer additional support for workplaces. So that can be, as you said, it could be individual grief counselling for any employees that might have experienced grief. And as you said, it complements the EAP. So an EAP is really important in workplaces for more kind of, I guess, like generalized mental health. But what the feedback that we've received time and time again is that often the EAP doesn't quite cut it in a situation of, someone you love passing away, or a life-limiting diagnosis, or even a miscarriage or stillbirth or loss of a child. And that more specialized grief support is what is needed with a specifically trained grief counsellor. So we can provide individual grief counselling for any employees that might need that. We also provide group counselling sessions in grief in the instance of for example, the loss of an employee within a team that might have impacted on like a group of employees within your workplace, or the passing of a client, for example. But we can bring a grief counsellor in for a group counselling session, which can be very therapeutic for groups of people to feel like, yes, that elephant in the room, I guess, is being lifted and they are able to work through that. So along with the corporate training, those are the types of provisions we provide to workplaces that might need some additional grief support.
That's great. It's a really end-to-end solution, very sensitive, but also I think incredibly important and something that we don't talk enough about. So how can businesses get in touch with you to explore this amazing professional service?
Yeah, great. So we are listed on Jungal. So first and foremost, you can find us on there. You can call our office number on 08 8332 1066 and ask to speak to the corporate liaison manager, who is me, about any of the provisions and how we might be able to support your workplace. You can even mention this interview, perhaps for a bit of a discount off of training, something else that I'm happy to offer. You can follow us on LinkedIn at Red Tree Foundation. That can provide just some sort of best practice tidbits on how to support a grieving employee in the workplace. And lastly, our website is redtreefoundation.org.au for more information about what we do as a charity, essentially, as a not-for-profit organisation providing best practice grief and loss support for individuals.
And we will make sure all the details and contact details are listed below in the description. Thank you so much for such an interesting insight into what professional services can do for organisations and the people who make them up. Thank you so much on this Monday, and I'll catch up with you soon.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Bye.